Hi, Risk Manager. Today, I'm going to talk about risk management in medical devices. This is one of the most important processes that proves the safety of the device that you're developing and that you need to pay extra attention to. And also the auditor, of course, will carefully look at that when auditing you. In safety risk management in medical devices, you basically have two standards that you need to follow. It is the ISO 14971. And in case you're developing software as a medical device, you need to definitely look at IEC 62304. But let's start from the beginning. What is safety? Safety is freedom from unacceptable risk. And that is the main requirement from the standard, that your device would be safe to use. In terms of risk analysis methods, you will have to do hazard analysis as a bare minimum. Hazard analysis is a top-down risk management method looking at a medical device, hazards, hazardous situations, and harms that these hazards can cause. But what is hazard? Hazard itself is a potential source of harm, and there are a lot of hazards around us that will not harm anybody as long as the medical devices are used in controlled manner. But uncontrolled situations or certain sequences of events may lead to potentially hazardous situations where hazards can be realized, and they could cause harm to the users and patients when they're realized. Now, what you need to do is that you need to first identify all the hazards by describing and documenting these potential sources of harm, by figuring out what could possibly go wrong in any foreseeable situation and what these hazardous situations may result in. In other words, what harm could occur to the users or the patients of your medical device when something goes wrong. Next, describe and document all foreseeable sequence of events that could lead to these hazardous situations in which the hazards can be realized. What could cause these situations? And in every one of those situations, you have to also determine the potential harm that the patients or users may have. To evaluate if a hazard is acceptable or unacceptable, you should rate the probability of occurrence of harm and the severity of that harm. In order to define the acceptability of any risk, you have to ask yourself whether your patient or the user of the medical device that you're developing can live with such a risk. And based on that determination, you can draw yourself a risk evaluation matrix or risk prioritization levels in which you can easily see the level of acceptability for each risk. If the risk now, after you have initially evaluated it, is on an unacceptable level, you will have to control that risk. In other words, you will have to mitigate the risk to acceptable level. And this is normally done by implementing protective measures that when we talk about software as a medical device, most often is another software item. And as such, you would link your risk to that specific software requirement or software requirements that would work as a risk control measure or risk mitigation action. So to sum it all up, first you identify the hazards, the potential source of harm, describe the situations where hazards may be realized and the harm that these hazards can cause. If the hazard is on an unacceptable level, you will have to mitigate or control that risk and describe the risk control that mitigates that risk. Next, you will have to put in place the verification actions. These are tests that ensure that the mitigation actions actually mitigate the risk to acceptable level. And finally, when you have done all that, you will have to do a residual risk assessment. Basically, you have to evaluate your risk again to see if the risk is now on an acceptable level. If it is not, then you have to describe why residual risk that remains is fine. And this is something that you have to do for every risk that remains on unacceptable level after you have evaluated it for the second time. This type of analysis of whether it is okay to have an unacceptable risk for your medical device is called risk-benefit analysis, and that can be split into three activities. First, you will have to summarize all the risks, including residual anomalies or software warnings or contraindications and so on. Then you will have to summarize all proven benefits of the use of the device. And finally, you have a meeting with a project team, management team. You will also include regulatory and quality people, and if possible, also an external expert of the device. And at that meeting, you agree that the risks have been mitigated as far as possible, and additional risk controls do not significantly reduce anymore the risk, and agree that each residual risk and the overall medical device residual risk is acceptable because the benefits of using the device outweigh the residual risk. Risk management is usually done by following checklists or group brainstorming to list all possible hazards and figure out all those foreseeable events in which hazards could be realized. And a lot of times, of course, you also look at similar devices that are already on market and what type of risks they had. So hazardous is a must-have risk management method for your medical device. Should you have software in your medical device? if you're developing software as a medical device, it is also highly recommended to look into FMEA, which is failure modes and effects analysis. But for now, let's look at how you could do hazard analysis inside Jira. SoftComply has developed several Atlassian apps for medical device developers. And one of those apps is SoftComply Risk Manager Plus on Jira Cloud. And in there, you can conduct hazard analysis and FMEA. SoftComply Risk Manager Plus provides you two main views, the risk model view and the risk table view. The first thing that you would want to do when you start using any risk management solution is to build out the risk models first. And SoftComply Risk Manager Plus comes with a set of templates for both the risk models and risk registers. And in here, you can easily pick a model that is closest to what you want, and you can, of course, customize it further. In here, you have a risk model already based on hazard analysis from ISO 14971 that you can pick, or you can alternatively create a risk model completely from scratch. And in here, you have 4 options to start with. You can customize it as you go. You have a 2-dimensional risk matrix where you have the severity and probability levels. You have 3-dimensional risk matrix, or you have the risk score-based model. So this is where you can have your risk prioritization number. And once you have selected it, in this particular case, we selected the risk level. You can say how many iterations you have. In ISO 14971, you would have 2 as iterations, initial risk assessment and residual. But in some cases, you would like to have more. You could have initial, current, and target assessment, and so on. You can have up to 10 risk assessments. And in here, you can define the levels for the severity and the levels for your risk classes. And if you're happy with how it looks like, you just give it a name and it will be there for locally all your Jira users who would like to use that particular risk model. In the risk table view, you can identify hazards in a spreadsheet view. And in that view, you can first see a quick look at the risk progress from the initial risk assessment to the residual risk assessment. And in here, you can then describe your hazardous situation in which potential hazards can be realized and the harm it may cause to the patient or the user of the device. You can tie it to the risk owner who can stay on top of it, who can evaluate the severity of the harm and the probability of occurrence of that harm, based on which you have the risk class automatically evaluated. If the risk is on an unacceptable level, you can also assign a mitigation action, which is very often a set of software requirements from another project, link it directly to this hazard here. And you can also link the verification actions, which are test cases most of the time, from yet another project here, so that you will have the traceability, which is one of the most important requirements in risk management in medical devices. Next, you can move on to the residual risk assessment, where you can have the second assessment of the same hazard after the mitigation of that risk to see if the risk that was previously on unacceptable level is now on acceptable level. And here you can do then the residual risk assessment based on which you have the residual risk class calculated. In order to understand where this model comes from, where you could build these severity and probability levels, we can check the risk model. And in here we had hazard analysis risk model. It is a 2-dimensional risk matrix where you have 3 classes. You have low, medium, and high risk class. And in here you can easily see where your current risks are. This was hazard analysis for medical device risk management on Jira. And you can try out SoftComply Risk Manager Plus for free for a month. And you can always come and join our live demos and book yourself a dedicated introduction session or onboarding session of the app. Thank you.